In the public markets of Victorian England, a man could sell his wife with a rope around her neck. This wasn't a myth, it was the poor man's divorce. Today, we uncover the shocking real-life stories behind this brutal custom and why it was an accepted part of life. If you love uncovering the hidden truths of the past, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's explore one of the strangest traditions in history. This exploration delves into the shocking custom of wife-selling, a practice that starkly contrasts with the refined public image of Victorian England. When one thinks of the Victorian era, 1837-1901, the mind often conjures images of a British society bound by strict moral codes, the formal grace of the aristocracy, and the monumental advancements of the Industrial Revolution. It was an age of magnificent crinoline dresses, elegant tea parties, and an unwavering belief in social order. However, hidden behind this veil of propriety and celebrated family values, a completely different reality existed, a shadow world where the poor and disenfranchised struggled to survive. In the heart of this supposedly civilized society, one of the most shocking and unbelievable customs not only existed but was widespread for a long period: the practice of wife-selling. Far from being a fictional tale, the act of selling one's wife was a real and desperate social phenomenon, revealing the deep-seated hypocrisy and legal failures of the era. This is not a dark fairy tale or a fictional plot from a Charles Dickens novel, but a real social phenomenon, a desperate solution born from the impotence of the legal system. This custom, with its imagery of a woman being led to market by a rope around her neck and sold to the highest bidder, starkly exposes the decay and injustice that lay deep within the foundations of Victorian society. It is a painful testament to the fact that for the working class, lofty concepts of justice, honor, and the sanctity of marriage were merely empty words. To understand why such a degrading act could take place, we must dive deep into the suffocating legal and social context that choked the lives of millions, especially women. To understand this practice, one must first examine the oppressive legal doctrine of coverture, which effectively erased a woman's legal identity upon marriage. The foundation of this injustice lay in a legal doctrine known as coverture, a medieval legacy that still profoundly influenced English law in the Victorian era. According to this doctrine, when a woman married, her legal identity was dissolved or covered by that of her husband. She ceased to be an independent individual before the law. Instead, she and her husband were considered a single entity, and the representative of that entity was the husband. The legal principle of coverture had devastating real-world consequences, legally trapping women in a state of near-total subjugation with virtually no escape from failed or abusive marriages. The consequences of coverture were far-reaching and devastating. Any property a woman owned before marriage, or any inheritance or wages she earned thereafter, automatically fell under the absolute ownership and control of her husband. She had no right to enter into contracts, sue, or be sued independently. Even her physical body was considered to belong to her husband. He had the legal right to inflict corporal punishment upon his wife, as long as it did not cause excessive injury, and had control over her social interactions. Essentially, a woman was transformed into a piece of property, a chattel with a legal status equivalent to a piece of furniture or livestock. In such a system, an escape from an unhappy, violent, or broken marriage was virtually non-existent for the vast majority of the population. Divorce was not a common civil procedure, but an incredibly complex and expensive process. To obtain a divorce, one had to petition the ecclesiastical courts for a legal separation, then sue the wife's lover in civil court for damages, and finally pass a private act of parliament to formally dissolve the marriage. This entire process required an enormous sum of money, amounting to hundreds or even thousands of pounds, an unimaginable figure for a worker earning just a few shillings a week. Thus, the door to divorce was open only to the aristocracy and the wealthiest bourgeoisie. For the working class, they were trapped. A man could abandon his wife and children without providing support, leaving them in extreme poverty. A woman could endure terrible abuse day after day with nowhere to turn, as the law had almost no mechanism to protect her. It was in this context of desperation and deadlock that the custom of wife-selling arose as an alternative, a form of poor man's divorce. As a desperate alternative to an impossible legal divorce, the ritual of wife-selling emerged as a public and highly symbolic ceremony for ending a marriage. In stark contrast to the private nature of modern legal proceedings, a wife sale was a highly public and ceremonial event. It was not a clandestine act, but a clear declaration before the community that a marriage had ended. The process usually followed a fairly consistent script. It often began with an announcement. The husband might place a short advertisement in a local newspaper or simply spread the word in pubs and residential areas. This announcement would state the intention to sell his wife, sometimes even describing her qualities as if she were merchandise. The process of the sale itself was a public spectacle, often culminating in a staged auction where the buyer was frequently prearranged. On the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a public place, typically a bustling market square, a cattle fair, or right in front of a crowded pub. The most iconic and shocking image of this ritual was the halter. The wife would have a rope tied around her neck, waist, or arm. This rope was not just a tool to lead her, but also carried a profound symbolic meaning. It equated the woman with livestock, a commodity that could be bought, sold, and transferred. An auction would then commence. The husband would loudly offer his wife for sale, stating the reasons he wanted to be rid of her. A curious crowd would gather, shouting and making comments. However, in the majority of cases, this auction was merely an elaborately staged play. The buyer was often predetermined. It could be the wife's lover, a sympathetic neighbor, or another man who had reached a private agreement with the couple. The wife sale, in these instances, was actually a way to legitimize a new relationship and publicly end the old one, a form of simultaneous divorce and remarriage witnessed by the entire community. The selling price varied widely. Some wives were sold for just a few pennies or a pint of ale, emphasizing the symbolic nature of the transaction. But there were also cases where the price was driven quite high, sometimes to tens or even £100, especially if the buyer was wealthy and genuinely desired the woman. Once the transaction was complete, the halter was passed from the hand of the old husband to the new, symbolizing the transfer of ownership and responsibility. Sometimes a bill of sale was even drawn up and signed by witnesses as a clumsy attempt to create a seemingly legal document for their actions. Challenging the simple narrative of victimhood, historical records reveal that many women were not merely passive victims, but active participants in their own sale. Viewed from the outside, the custom of wife-selling represents the pinnacle of humiliation and mistreatment of women. And undoubtedly, for many, it was a deeply shameful and painful experience. However, one of the most complex and surprising aspects of this phenomenon was the degree of participation and even initiative shown by the women themselves. In many instances, the act of being sold was a strategic choice for survival, allowing women to escape horrific situations and exercise a surprising degree of agency. History has recorded numerous cases where it was the wife who proposed or consented to her own sale. For a woman suffering from abuse, her husband's alcoholism or abandonment, being sold could be the only way out of a living hell. It was a choice between two terrible options, and she chose the lesser of two evils. By participating in arranging the sale, she could ensure that the buyer would be someone she loved and trusted, giving her a chance to start a new life, however bitter the beginning. The story of Mary Ann Price, mentioned in historical records, is a classic example. Trapped in a terrible marriage, she arranged with her lover for him to buy her from her abusive husband. For Mary Ann, being sold at the market was not a humiliation, but an act of liberation. Furthermore, there is evidence that women were not entirely passive in the process. Some flatly rejected buyers they did not like, showing that they still had a degree of self-determination. Their participation transformed this custom from a simple act of oppression into a complex survival strategy, a way to navigate and resist a legal and social system that had stripped them of all power. The societal and official response to wife selling was notably inconsistent, ranging from tacit acceptance by local authorities to outright condemnation. The attitude of the authorities and society towards wife selling was quite contradictory and changed over time. In the early stages, many local officials were uncertain or simply turned a blind eye. They were unsure whether they had the legal authority to intervene in a private agreement. Some parish officials even tacitly encouraged the custom for a very practical reason. If a man successfully sold his wife, the parish would not have to bear the financial burden of supporting the wife and her children if they were abandoned. The decline of this brutal custom was driven by a confluence of social reforms, growing public condemnation, and gradual changes to divorce laws in the 19th century. However, as the 19th century progressed, waves of social and religious reform began to spread across England. Activists, religious groups, like the Methodists, and the increasingly influential middle class strongly condemned wife selling, viewing it as an immoral, ungodly act and a stain on the reputation of a nation that considered itself civilized. Newspapers began to publish scathing critiques, and public pressure mounted. The courts also began to take a tougher stance. Those involved in wife selling, including the husband, wife, and buyer, were increasingly likely to be prosecuted for offenses such as public disorder, conspiracy, or even brothel keeping. Sentences also became harsher, ranging from fines to imprisonment. Alongside this, legal reforms were gradually implemented. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 established a new civil court for divorce, making the process slightly more accessible and less expensive, although still out of reach for many. Gradually, as the law began to offer a narrow escape from broken marriages, the need for an informal and extreme solution, like wife selling, diminished. The final chapter of this centuries-old practice closed in the early 20th century, marking the end of a dark tradition. The last reliably recorded case of a wife sale in England took place in 1913, when a woman was sold at the Leeds cattle market. This event marked the final end of a strange and dark custom that had persisted for over 2 centuries. Ultimately, the legacy of wife selling serves as a powerful historical lesson on the consequences of failed legal systems and the long, arduous struggle for women's rights and human dignity. The custom of wife selling is more than just a bizarre historical anecdote. It is a profound mirror reflecting the contradictions and injustices of Victorian society. It demonstrates the catastrophic failure of a legal system that could not meet the basic needs of its people, forcing them to resort to self-made solutions, even at the cost of their dignity. More importantly, it is a crucial chapter in the history of the fight for women's rights. It starkly exposes the status of women as property and highlights the long, arduous journey they had to travel to be recognized as equal human beings with full rights. The story of the women sold at market, as well as those who courageously participated in it to seek freedom, is a powerful reminder of the importance of justice, human dignity, and the necessity of building legal and social systems that truly serve and protect all people, regardless of gender or class. It forces us to ask, When the law becomes unjust, what will people do to find their own justice? And what is the price of freedom?